200 years ago, on March 30th, 1813, our ancestor Amasa Lyman was born in Lyman, New Hampshire. The humbling and challenging circumstances of his birth and childhood offered little hint of his future as a trailblazing pioneer, an impressive colonizer, and a popular leader and missionary. Amasa's father was one of the many desperate but hopeful souls who saw an untapped world of plenty in the western frontier of this new nation. He left his family while Amasa was yet an infant, hoping to lay claim on the treasures of the Mississippi River Valley. He never returned and was later rumored to have died near New Orleans. The young Amasa and his brothers and sisters were raised in turn by their mother, their grandparents, and ultimately their strict Calvinist uncle. Because of his turbulent upbringing, Amasa, like so many others in the heightened spiritual environment of the 1820s and 30s, quote, found peace with God and my soul in striving to break off my sins by righteousness and my iniquities by turning unto the Lord. However, he struggled to find an outlet for his newfound spirituality. His prayers were answered when two young Mormon elders, Lyman Johnson and Orson Pratt, came to his village in 1832. Much to the chagrin of his uncle, Amasa befriended these two young missionaries and was soon baptized. His family's opposition to his newfound faith was such that Amasa resolved to journey west and join the remainder of the Latter-day Saints in Ohio. Amasa left home with only 16 pounds of tattered clothing and $11.37. By stagecoach, canal, steamer, and foot, Amasa made the 700-mile trek alone. After nearly a month on the road, Amasa arrived at Hiram, Ohio. There he was welcomed by the Johnson family, the family of the missionary that Amasa had befriended, who offered him housing, employment, and the company of fellow Latter-day Saints. It was in their home that Amasa first met his newfound prophet, Joseph Smith. Of the impressions produced, he later wrote, I will here say, although there was nothing strange or different from other men in his personal appearance, yet when he grasped my hand in that cordial way known to those who have met him in the honest simplicity of truth, I felt as one of old in the presence of the Lord. My strength seemed to have gone, so that it required an effort on my part to stand on my feet. But in all of this there was no fear, but the serenity and peace of heaven pervaded my soul, and the still small voice of the Spirit whispered its living testimony to the depths of my soul, where it has ever remained, that he was a man of God. Joseph saw in Amasa the potential for a great missionary, and quickly sent him out to preach the gospel. Amasa spent the next several years in the better part of his life fulfilling that charge. He preached in Ohio, Virginia, New York, and participated in Zion's Camp's march to the Missouri. Because of his demonstrated loyalty and zeal, he was ordained a member of the First Quorum of the 70, organized in 1835. During a 3-week lull in his missionary work, Amasa, a man with no worldly prospects or assets of any kind, made a bold proposal to the daughter of perhaps the most wealthy Latter-day Saint in Kirtland. Too shy and inexperienced to convey his intentions in person, he wrote a poetic, if brief, letter. Having been a wanderer, and desiring to enjoy the blessings that would result from the society of a companion who would participate with me in the changing scenes of life, if you desire or feel willing to converse with me on the subject of matrimony, please write your answer below. It is with the belief that I would be happy in your company that I write you. Our grandmother, Maria Louisa Tanner, accepted his proposal, and the two were married 11 days later. After a 5-day honeymoon, Amasa was again in the mission field. Amasa and his newfound family circle in the Tanners would together experience many of the tragedies and heartaches of the late 1830s. As apostasy and opposition began to threaten their community in Kirtland, Amasa and the Tanners moved to Mormon settlements near far west Missouri. Within a year, however, storm clouds gathered over their new home as well. Amasa and his family were witnesses and victims of much of the violence and atrocities of the Mormon War and the expulsion in the fall of 1838. Amasa himself was imprisoned with Joseph Smith and other church leaders in Richmond, Missouri, while his father-in-law, John Tanner, was on at least one occasion severely beaten by a mob. Amasa was released after nearly a month in prison, and the family turned their backs on their brief Missouri home. After relocating in Iowa and later Nauvoo, Amasa spent the next several years serving missions in Illinois, Wisconsin, Indiana, and Tennessee. A momentous change in his life came in the summer of 1842. Orson Pratt, the missionary who had taught and baptized Amasi, wavered in his faith. Brigham Young and Heber C. Kimball, ever loyal but ever quick to chastise those who were not, ordained Amasi to take Orson's place in the quorum of the 12 apostles, under the direction of Joseph Smith. Orson's faith crisis was short-lived, however, and he returned to full fellowship just 5 months later. Joseph Smith characteristically quickly forgave him and restored Orson to his place in the quorum of the 12. But, not wanting to slight Amasi, he promised him a place in the first presidency. Despite Joseph's intentions, Amasi was never public sustained or recognized as a counselor to Joseph Smith. Joseph did attempt to drop the perennially ill Sidney Rigdon from his presidency at a general conference in October 1843. It was unsuccessful, due largely to his brother Hiram's pleadings and the popularity of Rigdon as a preacher. Some later suggested that Amasi had been secretly ordained to take Rigdon's place, notwithstanding the decision of the conference. But such talk only came after Joseph's death, when Rigdon was trying to gain control of the church and should be taken with a grain of salt. Again, by the April 1844 General Conference, William Law, the second counselor's apostasy, had vacated a position in the first presidency. But at the time, Joseph was still seeking a reconciliation with Law and neglected to appoint Amasi to take his place. Though on the first day of the conference, Amasi did speak in Joseph's stead when Joseph's voice was too weak to address the saints. Despite these setbacks, Joseph found other callings and positions for Amasi, making him, for example, the second counselor in the secretive and very important Quorum of the Anointed, the name given to the group that Joseph taught the temple endowment to, and the group that was later charged with presenting the endowment to the saints when the Nauvoo temple was completed. When the temple was finished in December 1845, Amasi performed more temple ordinances than any other church leader excepting Brigham Young and Heber C. Kimball. During the last 2 years of Joseph's life, Amasi became quite close to the prophet and often accompanied him on speaking tours or was directed to speak on his behalf. During this time, Joseph Smith likewise taught Amasi the principle of plural marriage. In fact, Joseph's last words to Amasi were a direction to practice the principles that Joseph had taught him, meaning plural marriage. By the time Amasi left Nauvoo, he had married 6 additional wives, including a former wife of Joseph Smith. He later took on an additional wife in Utah, bringing the total to 8. Though some of these women later divorced him, he continued to financially support them for the rest of his life, despite his meager funds. On June 27, 1844, the unthinkable happened, and Joseph Smith was murdered. Amasi and others, though sorrowful and horrified, sought to determine the direction the church should go. Soon after Joseph's death, Sidney Rigdon tried to capitalize on his position in the first presidency to gain control of the church. At a public meeting to judge the claims of Rigdon, Amasi stepped forward as a representative of the first presidency, though never formally sustained, to declare his support for the 12 and Brigham Young. Brigham Young, he said, has seen the relation I bear to my deceased brother Joseph. I never did conceive it gave me a precedence to go before the 12. I might rise up as well as any other man to ask for the presidency, but I could not do it without endangering my salvation. If Joseph Smith had any power to bear off the kingdom of God, the 12 have the same. The majority of the Latter-day Saints agreed with Amasi and the 12. Soon thereafter, Amasi was returned to the quorum of the 12 apostles and was busily involved in completing the temple and planning for the exodus from Nauvoo. On the trek west in 1847, Amasi traveled with Brigham Young's vanguard company. Halfway through the journey, he was sent south to meet a group of saints traveling west from Mississippi. He led that company to the Salt Lake Valley, reuniting with the 12 on July 27. Over the next several years, Amasi helped explore and settle their new mountain home. His most important contribution came in 1851 when he led nearly 500 men, women, and children to Southern California, where they founded San Bernardino. Amasi continued to be a popular leader and missionary throughout the 1850s and 60s. From 1860 to 62, Amasi presided over the European mission, alongside apostles Charles C. Rich and George Buchanan. Amasi enjoyed traveling around the continent, preaching the gospel wherever he went. Around this time, Amasi began to teach some non-conventional doctrines about Jesus Christ and the atonement. However, it should be remembered that this was a period when Mormonism was young, and its established doctrines were still being developed. Amasa wasn't alone in his wild speculation. Orson Pratt, Orson Hyde, and Brigham Young all explored the limits of Mormon orthodoxy about the nature of God and the future of man. Nevertheless, Amasa grew bolder in his speculating, and the stage was set for a confrontation with Brigham Young and the 12. Amasa's divergence from the church that he loved and worked so hard and sacrificed so much to build up is one of the toughest things to explain about his life. Some family members seeking to explain this aberrant behavior have insinuated that this change came about due to a lengthy period of depression and mental illness. Others have pointed to a supposed growing interest in spiritualism. Personally, I think his actions were largely motivated by a growing gulf and difference between Amasa and Brigham Young. Many of the other leaders of the church, like John Taylor and Edwin D. Woolley, respected the office and calling of Brigham Young, but frequently expressed frustration with his personality and leadership style. Amasa seems to fit into this group. For Amasa, the conflicting positions of the calling and the personality of Brigham Young were too difficult for him to reconcile. Amasa desired the freedom to do and say what he wanted, while Brigham Young stressed exact obedience to himself and other priesthood leaders. Ultimately, Amasa was dropped from the Quorum of the 12 in 1867 and excommunicated in 1870. Following his excommunication and until the end of his life, Amasa became a spokesman for a number of causes in defense of those who may have felt that they were slighted by the church. He was an ardent defender of free expression and helped dedicate an assembly hall in Salt Lake City for the purpose of providing a pulpit to speakers who may not have been welcome in Mormon meeting houses, which at the time were often used for secular lectures or debates, but only if approved by local leaders. He opposed the church's co-op stores and businesses that advocated limiting trade with non-members. He was an outspoken advocate for charity and compassion for all, regardless of religious differences. He practiced what he preached, and continued to cultivate old and new friendships with dedicated and disaffected Mormons alike, spiritualists, and a number of other religious leaders in Utah, including David H. Smith, the son of Joseph Smith, and RLDS missionary, and Methodist minister Norman McLeod. While his later opposition to the church and Brigham Young may be difficult for his descendants to understand, Amasa always felt that he was still true to the principles taught by Joseph Smith. He would be quick to point out Joseph's teaching that one of the grand fundamentals of principles of Mormonism is to receive truth, let it come from whence it may. Amasa's final years were spent at home in Fillmore. There, surrounded by his family, he doted on his orchards and the construction of a new home, until injury and ailment confined him to crutches and later to bed. He still read voraciously, and was noted to be a skilled conversationalist on almost any topic, but the end was growing near. After a brief illness, Amasa passed away on February 3rd, 1877. At his deathbed, his son Francis Marion, a rising star in the leadership of the LDS Church, said that he would stay by his father's side as long as he wished. Amasa simply responded, "Forever." How do we sum up such a complex and contradictory man? Surely he accomplished much in his life, but his final years may seem to tarnish his legacy for some of his family members. Perhaps his friend and brother-in-law and active Mormon bishop, Edward Parker Jr., said it best when he remarked that Amasa was, quote, a man who always taught and practiced honesty and morality as he understood it. Indeed, Amasa was a man of clear convictions who never strayed from the consequences of his actions. Many of his former friends and fellow leaders in the church expressed their belief that despite his final years, Amasa would, quote, no doubt come out all right in the end. We, his descendants, can rightly claim great pride in our connection to this forthright pioneer. His many and varied accomplishments demonstrate what can be accomplished through a life of courage, conviction, and sacrifice. Thank you.